The DC Extended Universe was supposed to be the answer to Marvel, an insane interconnected world of legendary heroes just like the MCU, but much darker, grittier, and bigger in scale. Instead, it became one of the most chaotic cinematic universes ever attempted, plagued by behind-the-scenes drama, studio interference, and box office bombs. So how did it all go so wrong for this universe that promised so much? At the end of the 20th century, both Marvel and DC movies were in a little bit of a problem. Marvel was practically bankrupt and had to sell almost all of their characters to basically any studio that would buy them. DC, however, had just released Batman and Robin, a movie so bad that it almost completely destroyed such a legendary character like Batman. Superman, on the other hand, had been on the shelf after the flop that was Superman 4. The future, however, was quite different for both of them. Marvel struck gold almost immediately after the 21st century had started with their X-Men movies, and DC hit the jackpot with Nolan's Batman trilogy shortly after. However, in the meantime, Marvel had been cooking in their kitchen with Chef Kevin Feige at the helm and birthed the MCU in 2008. Very soon, the MCU became mega popular and a global phenomenon, and DC had to get a piece of that cake. After the mediocre reception of Superman Returns in 2006, and the astronomically positive reception of Nolan's Batman trilogy, Warner Brothers, who basically hold the rights to all DC characters, realized that Nolan may just be the man to bring the Man of Steel back onto the big screen. Nolan, however, didn't really see himself doing this, and asked his friend, Zack Snyder, if he would do the movie instead. Zack accepted, Man of Steel was released, and the start of the DCEU was almost upon us. Zack had originally envisioned Man of Steel as a standalone, darker and grittier, grounded Superman story. But after the Avengers made $1.5 billion, Warner Brothers saw dollar signs in their eyes and rushed into building their own cinematic universe. Zack Snyder agreed to start building the DCEU, but still had his own original idea as to how it would happen and how he would go about doing it. Instead of doing it one hero at a time, Zack Snyder intended on making a 5-movie epic that would tell the story of Superman and the Justice League fighting their greatest nemesis, Darkseid, in an all-out war to save Earth. Sounds pretty epic, right? Well, they were off to a decent start, as Man of Steel, despite fans and critics being slightly divided, soared to almost $700 million globally. However, Snyder's next project would be the first sign of the problems that would follow the DCEU until its downfall. After Man of Steel, Zack Snyder immediately felt that he needed to see how Batman would react to the aftermath of Zod fighting Superman, and just like that, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice was born. When the movie was finally released in 2016, it garnered mixed reactions, but even so, managed to bag more than $800 million. This was still considered to be much less than expected, and it would soon show exactly why it underperformed. As it turns out, Warner Brothers simply couldn't stop trying to copy what the MCU did, and kept meddling with the director's visions. This is exactly how Batman v Superman got cut down by more than 30 minutes. And once Zack Snyder finally released his final ultimate version, the fans loved it, and were left baffled as to why this couldn't be the movie they saw in theaters. Warner Brothers seemed to have been spooked by the runtime, thinking that superhero fans couldn't handle a runtime of over 3 hours. Next on the list, once again, looking for a way to replicate what Marvel had done so well with Guardians of the Galaxy, Warner Brothers hired David Ayer to handle directing the Suicide Squad movie. Warner Brothers really went all out, hiring Will Smith, Margot Robbie, and Jared Leto to star in the movie. After the trailers were released, apart from people being slightly skeptical about how Jared Leto would handle portraying the Joker after the legendary Heath Ledger, the receptions were overwhelmingly positive. However, Warner Bros. Panicked, too scared that the dark and serious tone would not earn as much money as the Marvel movies, which were notoriously lighthearted and comedic. Warner Brothers backed off and, instead of the movie the trailers promised it would be, the entire tone of the movie was changed. They added a very heavy pop soundtrack to the movie and cut it up completely differently than the director, David Ayer, had imagined, supposedly to make it more fun. The movie came out, and it was received pretty horrendously, to the extent that David Ayer has still actively been trying to get his cut released for the past 8 years or so. The support for the release of the so-called Ayer cut has been incredibly large, although David Ayer himself seems to have lost interest as of recently, but it still remains to be seen what will happen in the end. Once again, despite all of these problems, people still went to see the movie, and it made over $800 million, but there could be only so many flops before people stopped going to the theaters. The point that most people consider the breaking point for the DCEU is, of course, the Justice League movie. Just before that, however, the DCEU had gotten their first uncompromised hit with Wonder Woman. The movie was received fantastically, earning a lot of money as well as garnering praise from both the critics and fans. Unfortunately, instead of riding this wave of positivity, the DCEU was in for a pretty bumpy ride. Zack Snyder was directing the Justice League movie, the third in his planned saga of 5 movies, when he suffered a massive tragedy in his personal life, causing him to back out of the project. After this, Warner Brothers hired Joss Whedon, a director with a completely different vision and directing style to helm the project till completion. Joss Whedon had previously directed 2 Avengers movies, and his directing style matched the Marvel formula much more than it did the darker tone Zack Snyder had envisioned. So, heavy reshoots, a complete tonal and color palette change, and one goofy CGI mustache later, Warner Brothers were left with a movie that was basically a parody of MCU movies, right down to the humor, which was completely mismatched with the characters and the vision that Zack Snyder originally had. This all resulted in the movie being received quite negatively, the DCEU going completely off the rails, and the fans lost almost all hopes they had for it succeeding. Or did they? The next movie in line was Aquaman, and it actually managed to pull in more than $1 billion at the box office. For a moment, it seemed like the DCEU was back on track. It was a fresh take on a character that had never been properly adapted before. The CGI was decent, the villains worked, and it was all in all a very solid movie, and the box office confirmed this. After it came Shazam, and while much smaller in scale, it was actually a surprise hit and almost universally loved as a goofy family superhero movie, also managing to earn a fair amount of money at the box office. However, the problem was, these movies weren't really contributing to a larger universe like Warner Brothers wanted, so they lacked a sort of cohesion, as well as a clear direction for the future. After this, once again, instead of riding the success train, the DCEU went straight back to box office bombs. Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman 1984 were the next movies to come out, and they were both received as being very mediocre, offering nothing new at all. Even worse for DC, this was right around the time Marvel were bathing in cash after the success of Endgame and Infinity War, yet they were completely powerless to do anything about it. It was all completely going off the rails, and it was evident that some sort of change was desperately needed. Still with a bitter taste in their mouths, the fans begged Warner Brothers to somehow allow Zack Snyder to finish his version of the Justice League movie, as they recognized that greatness was sitting stashed on some shelf in the Warner Brothers studios. After a massive social media campaign that became a global phenomenon, flying under the hashtag "Release the Snyder Cut," Warner Brothers caved to fan pressure and gave Zack Snyder the permission to finish the movie and even gave him some extra budget to fix it up. Due to world events at the time, they made the decision for it to go straight to streaming services instead of the theaters. Once the movie came out, the fans loved it. Tears of joy were poured out as the fans finally witnessed the 4-hour epic that was supposed to be the movie all along. And many people even tried persuading Warner Brothers to let Zack Snyder finish his 5-movie vision. However, all they got was a big fat no. Instead, Warner Brothers, still not knowing how to continue trying to build their universe, hired acclaimed director James Gunn after he had fallen out with Marvel to do, you guessed it, a remake of the Suicide Squad movie, essentially retconning the previous one. Unfortunately, James Gunn's Suicide Squad flopped hard in theaters as it was released at the same time on streaming, once again due to the global situation, but was in fact greatly received by the fans and considered a vast improvement on the original movie. Given the fact that the DCEU was going downhill and fast, Warner Brothers were pretty desperate and thought, who better to save our cinematic universe than The Rock as Black Adam? And just like that, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson promised that Black Adam would change everything. He wasn't just making a movie, he was trying to take control of the entire DC franchise and even brought back Henry Cavill as Superman, hyping up a Black Adam versus Superman fight. The movie flopped hard. Actually, it barely broke even at the box office, and for a film meant to change the hierarchy of power in the DC universe, it proved that Warner Brothers' problems ran much deeper than one bad movie. At this point, Warner Brothers had no plan left. Fixing the DCEU was basically impossible, so instead, Warner Brothers made the final call. The DCEU was done and dusted. Looking at their past few movies at the time, they realized that the only movie which was actually positively received was The Suicide Squad, as well as the only TV show they had made up to that point, Peacemaker. It was no coincidence that the same man was behind both projects, James Gunn. So, Warner Brothers decided to hedge their bets and put this man in charge of the future of this universe. James Gunn immediately made a controversial impact and fired almost everyone from the remnants of the DCEU, including a fan favorite like Henry Cavill, who had just been brought back only a few months prior. However, there were still 4 more DCEU movies on the way, but everyone knew the truth. These movies were the remains of a done universe, and they were no longer leading to anything. And when they finally released, they ended up being box office bombs. Just like that, The Flash, Shazam 2, and Aquaman 2 were practically dead on arrival, competing only in terms of which one would flop harder. Blue Beetle was also released, and, surprisingly, James Gunn decided to keep his character and actor in the new universe he is creating, also choosing to keep Peacemaker, as well as some of the characters established in his Suicide Squad movie. So what's next? The first thing James Gunn did was remove the E from the DCEU, renaming it the DCU, in hopes the name reset would also warrant a quality reset. On top of that, James Gunn decided to do something that had never been done before, which is to create a universe which would mix animation and live action, while keeping all of the actors the same. Finally, a steady hand seemed to take over and start guiding the universe in a better direction, and that's exactly what the DCEU never had. On paper, the DCEU had all the tools to succeed: some of the biggest superheroes in history, a massive studio behind it, and a fan base desperate for something great. But mismanagement, constant course correcting, and the failure to trust its own creators turned it into one of Hollywood's biggest missed opportunities. Meanwhile, Marvel, despite starting with weaker characters, became the biggest franchise in the world, proving that a long-term vision is more important than just big names and big budgets. Now, James Gunn is wiping the slate clean and starting over with the DCU, with Superman as his first live-action project, and the future is finally looking bright. Whether this will be the fresh start DC needs, or if the superhero genre is already too far gone, only time will tell. If you want to dive even deeper into the world of superheroes, check out our video on Unusual Wolverine Facts Only Fans Know, where we go deep down into the world of everyone's favorite Clawed Mutant. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Heroscope, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more deep dives into your favorite characters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.